Boss fights. Every game has them, from action adventures to first-person shooters to RPGs and JRPGs. But in this day and age, what makes a good boss fight? I've been thinking about that recently since I've been playing some old games that are a few years old now. And then I played Suicide Squad at a discount, and I was curious how they're going to manage boss fights with heroes like the Flash and Superman. To no one's surprise, I'm sure they're both terrible among other boss fights in that game. So what is that makes up a good boss fight? That's what I'm going to get into today, going through what I think makes up a good boss fight and some of my favourites, as well as what my favourite boss fight is of all time. Also, beware spoilers for some boss fights. But to figure that out, I think it's just best to go through the building blocks that make up a good boss fight. Of course, you have the usual that the boss deals more damage than standard enemies and takes more damage. Pretty standard stuff, but as you look into different genres, they do tend to have small things that make them unique, yet also sharing a lot of blueprints. Now, I'm not going to keep using it as an example, but Suicide Squad's attempts were just to make every enemy, and the bosses especially, have a crazy amount of health, or the classic shoot the glowy things on the boss, and that's pretty much it. Not what I'd call exciting or even challenging, it's just a boring grind, which, let's be fair, a lot of games do that, but at least in other games the gameplay is enjoyable enough to not mind the grind as much. Another game I feel suffered this is Hellblade 2, where the bosses are just the same as any enemy, and the gameplay is just 3 buttons: dodge, parry, and attack. And after 7 years of development, that's just crazy. Or Spider-Man 2, which I did enjoy, but if it wasn't for the gameplay being somewhat fun, the boss fights would have suffered so much more. But for me, things like bullet sponges or shoot the glowy things just isn't acceptable anymore. That's more PS2 era, or even a bit of PS3 and 360. So what other kinds are out there nowadays? Well, another would be the gimmicky boss fights. You know, the ones like in Uncharted 2 for example, where the final boss can only be damaged by shooting the blue sacks of sap. Which isn't terrible as far as ideas go. I mean, it certainly makes it a little bit more interesting, but for me it just didn't pull it off all that well. Or in the first Infamous game, when fighting the first major boss, where the goal is to just pull tentacles from her body and avoid the tar on the floor. But they did get some gimmicky boss fights well in those games. Like in the sequel when fighting Bertrand, once he changes form, you have to shoot the glowy things, which makes a little bit more sense than most games based on where they are in his body, such as his elbows or the inner chest. A game that does this kind of thing brilliantly to me though is the Mr. Freeze. No, not that one, the one from the Arkham game. In that fight, Mr. Freeze adapts to your attacks. For example, if you sneak up behind him and attack, he will then start watching behind himself. If you jump from above, he will freeze all vantage points to prevent that. Or if you place explosive gel, he then walks down the stand for that and you on the floors.
Feed from his suit, now.
No problem. Bruce, remember what happened last time. Don't try to take him on in a straight...
And when all that to me makes the boss fight not only fun, but makes you use some strategy and feels rewarding when you work out your next attack and eventually take him down. A type that has also become pretty popular are the kind of boss fights that the Dark Souls games have done. Though they may not have been the first to implement these kinds of boss fights, I would still argue they're the best when it comes to it. Not saying that other developers haven't done great themselves, such as the Jedi games, God of War, Shadow of War, and even Horizon. To me, these boss fights are great standard boss fights, more so the Dark Souls bosses, but we'll get on that in a little bit. What I mean in a general sense is the boss has a health bar, maybe stamina bar, depending on the specific game, and you fight them while they have their own set of skills and abilities versus your own. And again, depending on the specific game, they may have an extra phase or two, where they have more attacks, faster attacks, new buffs on themselves, etc. Now, for the reason I picked God of War and Horizon specifically is because they are more recent games and take that formula and put their own little spin on it, unlike the Jedi games. Like God of War from 2018, which was the first game in the new reboot that they've done. It gave you all the classic boss fights, although the variety of bosses was sorely lacking, but the sequel Ragnarok really got it right in my opinion. They had you fighting lots of different monsters.
Yeah. Get out of my house!
Through here, follow me.
Invulnerable when it's
Close in! Attack!
Gods.
About time.
What the? Huh?
Vanguards.
Mothers, help me!
etc. all with their own unique challenges to overcome, as well as giving you new weapons and abilities to fight back against them. And if you really get good at it, the combos that can be put together is crazy.
See you pay for what you've done!
As for Horizon, they took it and put a different little spin on it. Yeah, the humans in that game are very boring, but let's be real, the only reason people are playing it is for the mechanical dinosaurs. Now it isn't anything crazy, but each dinosaur having their own strengths and weaknesses, usually based on the animal that they are made after, but being mechanical have very interesting variations. Like the Grazer's antlers being able to dig up the ground, or Stalker's being able to go invisible. Then with that, each one could also have some kind of elemental effects, like fire, poison, ice, etc. And they also include alpha versions of some of these enemies in the world, which to me almost serves like mini boss fights, and that's enough variety for me in the fights to make one each a bit more interesting and keeps each encounter even slightly different from the last, if not significantly different. Also, depending on the fight, you had the options to make a loadout suitable to the fight, like fighting a fire variation with an ice weapon, or if you had one cloaking, you could use electricity to short circuit that cloak, and if they could fly, you could use some kind of grapple gun and anchor them to the ground and pull them down, and a lot more. As for Shadow War, it gets looked over because of the launch of the microtransactions, which honestly, when I first played the game, I never noticed until after I beat it, although it was a long ass grind for the endgame. But nowadays, since all of that has been removed and some of its updates and tweaks to the endgame, it's now a lot more fun. And since Warner Bros. Have a patent on the Nemesis system, it's really the only game where you can enjoy these kinds of boss fights. Now, similar in a way to Horizon, you have enemies who have their strengths and weaknesses, like them fighting with a fire weapon, poison weapon, crossbows, dark weapons, etc. As well as weaknesses, like they may be afraid of certain animals, so if we bring them along to the fight, they might get a debuff, or be weak to stealth attacks or executions, things like that. But what I find stands out about it is the fact that they can adapt to how you play. Like if you keep throwing daggers, they will eventually dodge them, or if you vault over them, they'll learn to block the vault and throw you back. For me, it makes a more generic boss fights throughout the game a lot more fun and engaging, and as I keep coming back to, it makes you use your brain a little bit rather than button mashing, or say in a first person game where you just empty the clip after flip to them until they're dead. Now for the grandfather of them all, the Dark Souls games, which I would also include the other developers' games in that category. Of course, these games are known for their get good mindset, but once you look past that, I find it to be such rewarding boss fights. But that's not to say they don't sprinkle in their own gimmicky bosses from time to time, which aren't always bad when there are so many bosses in those games. With the Souls games specifically, you have a multitude of ways to approach the fight, whether it be with magic, ranged, melee, with both fast weapons or heavy strong weapons, and everything in between. Each boss, if not most of them, challenge you in some new way, whether it be their speed, AoE attacks, poison arenas, handicap fights, etc. They're always rewarding to finally beat that boss after you throwing yourself against them for hours at a time. But for me personally, these games also includes my favourite boss fight, which would be Genichiro from Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Now this isn't my favourite because it's the flashiest fight, or epic, or cinematic, or whatever other adjectives you can think of. The reason for it, and again all this is purely my own opinion on things, is the fact that in Sekiro specifically, you don't have the choice to make a build with your character and switching out weapons and armour. You have a sword and a handful of gadgets by this point in the game, and to me, if there was ever a get good game, it's this one, because you really have no choice but to just get good. Now leading up to him, you have to fight a few mini bosses and regular bosses, which I feel each prepares you for this because they all have their own unique ways to attack. Like the troll, that helped me get better at dodging almost insta-kill grab attacks. The bull that has you constantly on the move and timing your attacks. The Ashina Elite, who makes you get your parry down to the millisecond or he just destroys you. And all that skill you learn has to come together to beat him. The thing about Sekiro too is compared to the other Souls games, it has fast-paced combat, and you actually seem to be punished if you try to play it safe when in a tight space, so being aggressive is encouraged. So what is it that I love about this fight? Well, take a look at this clip. As you can see, it's lacking all the bells and whistles of other games fights, or even other fights in this game. It's just two guys with katanas dueling with fast-paced blows being shared, and the thrill of being in the zone with blocking, parrying, countering and dodging in time, as well as landing your own hits, is just unmatched in how cool and badass I felt in that fight. Now this does have a second phase which does give him some superpowers, but even that doesn't take away much from me, as if you time it well you can absorb his power and use it back against him. So for me, that is what I consider my favourite boss fight, and I'd be interested in hearing what yours is in the comments. So there you have it. That is how I feel about the state of current boss fights, what I think make up good boss fights, and my own personal favourite. Hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope to see you next time.